This is the largest living snake, a reticulated python. The specific one you're looking at is 22 feet long, but this snake was twice as long, and we didn't even know it existed until last year. The largest captive snake to ever be recorded was reticulated python, this exact species of snake that you're looking at right here. That snake measured at 25 feet long, which is a very, very long snake, 25 feet and 2 inches. Now, there have been reported claims of 32-foot reticulated pythons in Indonesia, one of them from 1912. So let's suppose this is true. A 32-foot snake is 10 feet longer than this snake here. Generally, when a snake is going to be longer, if it's the same species, that means it's going to be much thicker around as well. So a snake that is approximately 33% longer than this one would be a heck of a lot bigger around, and this snake is 177 pounds. Think about how big that snake would be. Of course, keep in mind, anacondas are much bigger, but we're making a python comparison for a reason. But this snake might have been 50 feet long. And just at the beginning, so it's not clickbait, you can't keep 50-foot snakes. You're not gonna see them in any zoos or private collections. Right now, you can't go and buy a container like at chewy.com or something for your 50-foot snake. But if you have pet snakes that are reasonable to keep, you know, ball pythons and corn snakes and boas and stuff, chewy.com, it's where I buy all of my stuff. And right now there's a killer deal on enclosures, 4x2x2s, which are perfect for, you know, ball pythons and corn snakes and things that you can actually keep, as well as the lighting, substrate, feeders, everything that you need. It's all at chewy.com, link below. Keep in mind when I talk about historical accounts of snakes that have been around when people are, they're oftentimes exaggerated, especially in places like Indonesia in 1912, where it wasn't, you know, it's pretty remote. I mean, look at Indonesia on a map. There are thousands of islands. I'm sure Matt, the editor, will put exactly how many here, but it's incredible. Indonesia could be several different countries. You don't really realize until you've been there that if you've been on one island, it is completely a different world than one that's not that far away. Hundreds of languages just in this one spot. Anyway, let's suppose that is true, a 32-foot snake. That pales in comparison to the snake that we thought until last year was the biggest snake to have ever lived. This is Titanoboa. We did an entire video last year right here about how it's still alive, although we're talking about an anaconda species, which is probably the animal that Titanoboa was most closely related to. Titanoboa wasn't even formally described until 2009. For context, described and discovered are a little bit different. An animal that is formally described is accepted by science as a brand new species. There's a lot of animals that have been discovered long before they were described. For example, I've been all around the world. I've seen lots of animals that nobody knows exist, that these villagers or locals or guides have found, but haven't had luck having a scientist actually say, yes, that is a species. The first vertebrae or bones or fossils of a Titanoboa were found in 2002, and this was in a coal mine in Colombia. This led to an expedition going until 2004 where they discovered lots and lots of these vertebrae, and originally they thought they were a crocodilian type reptile. Now I'm gonna say crocodilian, python, boa. Keep in mind, I'm just talking about what these animals are most closely related to, because back then, technically, Titanoboa isn't a boa, it's something completely different. Just keep in mind, we're talking in generalities here. Titanoboa is thought to live about 60 million years ago, 60, 58 million, somewhere around there. And Colombia at the time is going to have a very similar climate to what it is right now. If you're looking for a comparison, like I said before, anacondas, green anacondas would be probably the closest that we have. We don't know what Titanoboa looked like. Maybe it was green with these orange type spots. We have no idea, because the only thing that we have are some vertebrae, and the more we find, the more we realize how big it was, which was likely 43 to 48 feet. And because we think it was similar to an anaconda in that it's a boid, in that it's very heavy bodied and probably spending most of its time in the water, which is what heavy bodied snakes likely are going to do when they're up to 4,000 pounds. Just think about it, a 4,000 pound animal. Remember, this python that you're looking at here that I was holding last week was 170 pounds. It's unlikely that if you were to straddle it, it would be able to put your feet on the ground. You'd probably straddle it more like a horse than any snake that we ever see. And Titanoboa is impressive, don't get me wrong, but this snake is much more impressive. This is Vasuki indicus. If you are familiar at all with Indian culture, you might have heard of Vasuki before from Indian mythology. This snake is named after those myths or legends. And Vasuki is not interesting, I would say fascinating actually, just because it's a snake that is bigger. It's fascinating because this isn't a boid or an ancestor of a boid, it's closer related to an ancestor of a python species. Not only that, but it's not from anywhere near where the Titanoboa was found. This is an animal from India. Now keep in mind, India still has some pretty big snakes. There's some rock pythons in India, and on that landmass in Asia, because I mean, reticulated pythons are from places like Indonesia, for example, or Thailand. Those are places you'd find them, and I've actually found them myself, but I've never found a reticulated python close to 50 feet, which is what the estimate for Vasuki is. Vasuki was thought to live about 47 million years ago. It wasn't formally described until 2024, so just about a year ago, just shy of a year ago, we finally described and said, hey, yes, this is legit. This is a brand new species that we've discovered from 47 million years ago. Vasuki and Titanoboa are really similar in that they're both found in coal mines. So this is a picture of a coal mine, and there's always layers, right? So you see layers of fossils, and that's how you date them, or partly how you date them. This is how we know it was around 47 million years ago that this animal lived. Again, it was vertebrae that were found. So vertebrae, the backbones of the animal, which helps you figure out how big the animal is going to be, or how big the animal was, I should say. And just like Titanoboa, the people who found them, and even the scientists who were called in to study them, thought it was a crocodilian type reptile until 2022. So this means that this is over 20 years ago, or almost 20 years ago, in 2005, when these were first found in the coal mine, these vertebrae, and they were put on a shelf and studied a little bit, and then when it was brought back up to scientists who looked into it in 2022, they decided, no, that's not a crocodilian, that is a snake. This made it very interesting because now we have something that might have been a similar size to what we think is the biggest snake in the world. And keep in mind, these are all guesses, right? We don't have complete skeletons from either animal. So we're projecting based on those vertebrae how big Vasuki must have been. And it must have been around 50 feet at max. What's interesting too is it was thought to be a large cylindrical body. So something similar to what you'd see with a reticulated python, but it's thought that it would be much larger in comparison, heavier body. Reticulated pythons, which I can keep comparing them to because that's the largest python species still living today, are semi-arboreal. Whenever you find them, you're likely going to be finding them in the trees. Even the big ones are going to be off the ground most of the time. Here's another great example. This snake is 170 pounds, 22 feet long, and he's crawling around the rafters at Reach Out Reptiles. It's not thought that Vasuki was in the trees and not a semi-arboreal snake. We don't know exactly what this animal ate, but we do think that it probably didn't spend a lot of its time in the water like we think Titanoboa did. Keep in mind, it was only described last year, so this is very preliminary. Who knows what we're gonna find when we find more vertebrae? There were very few things alive on Earth at the time that this animal couldn't have eaten. And we think that it constricted its prey because it wasn't a venomous snake. It's a python ancestor, so likely what would have happened is it would have taken its jaws, which would have been the size of a human basically, grabbed a hold of whatever it wanted to eat, and then coiled around it and constricted it just like today's pythons. So this brings us to the question that I get when I do videos like this: how did things get so big then? Why did they get so big then but not now? If you are new to looking at extinct species in wonder and awe, like I've been doing since I was a little kid, that's a really great question. Why is it that there was land sloths so huge, humongous back then? How is it that all these animals were so much bigger where now we don't have animals like that? Well, there's a few reasons, and of course, keep in mind there's lots and lots of reasons. I'm really simplifying it here. But first of all, I mean, they didn't have the predators like humans then. Millions of years ago, there was no humans to decimate these animals. Also, the climate was a lot different back then. CO2 levels and oxygen levels were very, very different, and the heat was very different too. So for example, I live in Canada. Things grow really slow here. Things change really, really slow here. But if you go to places like the Amazon, around the equator, even in parts of Africa, Indonesia, things generally evolve much quicker because there are no off-season. You don't have 6 months of stagnation. Here, the trees don't grow for 6 months. Animals are generally hibernating for 6 months. If you're in a place where you don't have to take 6 months off, things are gonna go at, well, about double the speed. So you can have these animals and they can be supported because the oxygen and CO2 levels are more conducive for giant animals. Now, we don't really have that right atmosphere for an animal that big, which is why we don't have animals that big generally, with some exceptions, of course. Keep in mind, the blue whale, which is a marine mammal, of course, is the biggest animal, we think, to have ever lived ever, and it's still alive now. But we know that most large land animals are the largest land animals. I mean, of course, we still have giraffes and elephants and rhinoceros and hippos, but there used to be a lot more huge megafauna. I made that up, megafauna. It should be in a textbook though. So simply, the world was a lot different 60 million years ago than it is today. Temperature, atmosphere, and predators. And also prey items too. There aren't prey items to sustain an animal that big. Imagine how big the prey animals must have been for those giant snakes to eat, or how many smaller items they'd have to eat. There just isn't that type of prey anymore. And lastly, is it possible that giant snakes over 32 feet, like we have a record of from Indonesia, whether it's true or not, exist? Is it possible that we can still find giants bigger than anything we've ever seen before? The answer is yes, of course. We have seen species go extinct and then found those species pretty recently, actually. I did a whole video on another channel right here about species that we've rediscovered that were extinct. So is it possible that vasuki or Titanoboa might be found ever again? Almost certainly no. And is it possible that there's different giant snake species that we haven't discovered? Probably not. It'd be really, really unlikely for that ever to happen. However, what's much more likely is to find giants that we've just never seen before. So of course, we can discover something new. Is it possible that we find a reticulated python that's 33 feet? Yes, it definitely is. If you look at where these animals are found, especially, Burmese pythons in the Everglades, this is a different species, of course, we find monsters all the time. Massive snakes that how the heck did they grow this big without being found? Well, in those environments, like the Everglades, I'm using that as an example because more people have been to the Everglades than places in Indonesia and Papua. It's intraversible. You can really never get deep enough to find the animals that are the deepest. Saying that there's no 33-foot anacondas is like taking a scoop out of the ocean and saying, yeah, there's no whales in here. This is something that, of course, a lot of people use for aliens and whatever else in the galaxy, but the same analogy applies. We haven't seen everywhere that we need to see where these animals we know that they are in the first place. So what if the biggest snakes are just in places that humans have never been to? Is it likely? No. Very unlikely, in fact. But it's not impossible, and it's in fact probable that one day we will find another giant snake bigger than anything we've ever found before. 50 foot? Almost certainly not. Is this exciting for you? Do you want to see more videos like this? Let me know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for hitting like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And the Patreon supporters, you guys get videos early, discounts on merch, secrets in this reptile room that nobody else knows, one-on-ones, all that for as little as $1 a month. Because I do videos twice a week, that means I'll see you. Actually, there's a bonus video on Saturday. See you then.